Hello, everybody. My name is Andrew Garner, and the topic that I was given for Chapter 10 Air Quality PowerPoint is heavy metal pollution. So we'll be exploring how metals are impacting our air quality, our environment, and our health. So, what is a heavy metal? Heavy metal is a metallic element on the periodic table that have a relatively high molecular weight. So to describe those further, they're very dense, so they've got a high atomic weight. They're often toxic to organisms at certain concentrations. So that's especially when they're consumed or inhaled as dust or in their gaseous form. And they're not naturally present in the atmosphere in very high amounts. They're present, but humans have really contributed to high amounts of them in the atmosphere. So some common examples are lead, mercury, chromium, cadmium, arsenic, zinc, and a bunch more. And so these all have a specific gravity greater than 5, which really means the ratio of the density of a substance to a reference, which is most often water. So it really just puts density into a context of comparison with something we're familiar with. Where do heavy metals come from? So there's two ways that heavy metals enter our environment and our atmosphere. One is natural sources. So heavy metals are naturally found in Earth's crust. They're expelled in volcanic eruptions, secreted from sea salts, and are distributed through dispersion of natural metallic dust. And so our textbook says an analysis of ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica revealed that atmospheric concentrations of heavy metals have increased several-fold over the past 200 years. So if you think about it, our Earth is millions of years old, and in just the past 200, we've exponentially increased the amount of these materials in the atmosphere. So you can see nature is not really the main issue. Instead, it's anthropogenic causes, which is our next point. So anthropogenic sources, human activities are fossil fuel combustion, metal smelting, incineration of metal-containing waste, and many other industrial processes. And so heavy metals are also, they leak from landfills and waste dumps and are often secreted by man-made pesticides or fertilizers. And so some common heavy metals, we've got mercury and lead. So mercury is pretty famous, symbol Hg, density as we talked about earlier, it's 13.53. It's extremely toxic. And so it's distributed through our environment through the mercury cycle and bioaccumulation, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And so it's expelled in the atmosphere from industrial centers in gaseous form usually. And the gas combines with dust and water and is dispersed all over our globe. And mercury is used in the production of fluorescent light bulbs. And so those factories kind of just secrete all sorts of mercury in gaseous form, which enters our air and water systems. And so lead is pretty commonly found heavy metal, symbol Pb, density 11.34. It had many common uses until its toxicity was discovered. 10,000 years ago, lead emissions were around 150 tons. But in the 1970s, the emissions grew to over 200,000 metric tons a year. And that's partially because lead was actually used in gasoline before that. And until the 1980s, it was prevalent in gas. And catalytic converters, they kind of convert toxic waste from car emissions, and the lead actually deactivates the catalysts in that catalytic converter and causes major damage to our environment. So human, environmental, and economic impacts. Human impacts, heavy metals have many impacts on humans' health, like metal poisoning, impaired neurological functions, disrupted cellular growth, inhibited blood synthesis, cardiovascular risks, and organ damage. So some environmental impacts, when released into the environment, they combine with water and other substances and are absorbed, and they work their way through our ecosystems. And they do that through bioaccumulation, which is as toxic metals like mercury travel up the food chain, they accumulate and are consumed by larger animals, leading to high concentrations in the top levels, which is how humans end up absorbing this mercury. So some economic impacts. Companies must pay for remedies and prevention technologies like the smokestack scrubbers. Then medical bills have increased from humans being affected by poisoning and long-term exposure. And the EPA compliance costs for pollutant measures and bioaccumulation levels in seafood have skyrocketed in recent years. How can we solve this issue? We really just have to remove the heavy metals that are currently in the environment because they're non-biodegradable. And we can do this through chemical biological remediation, which is combining chemical precipitation and biological treatments to remove heavy metals from contaminated substances. We can also use electrokinetic microbial remediation, which uses the electrical currents in fields to remove those metals from substances like water and soil. And lastly, we can use phytobial remediation, which is using plants and microbes to take up the heavy metals and remove them from our soils and water. And we also can prevent this in the future by mandating technology like scrubbers and filters on all factories that release metals from their operations. We can use legislation to enforce monitoring protocols on all industrial plants so that we know what's being released and the amount from these major factories, and we can focus on techniques to reduce those. And lastly, we can use cap and trade techniques on the amount of heavy metal waste that's dispersed by these industrial companies, which would really help allow a free market to allocate rights to a stable amount to be disposed of each year. Here are the sources. These are textbook, couple online sources to get some education on heavy metals. And for a short essay question, I would like you guys to answer this based on what I've talked about in PowerPoint so far. So what are heavy metals? They're natural and anthropogenic sources in our atmosphere and ecosystems. And what are their effects on our environment, economy, and health? Thank you guys for listening.